Hi everyone, I'm Zach Reinhardt, here to review the new Kumagusu album, Natsu. Kumagusu is a four-piece indie rock band from Tokyo, and this is their first full-length album. I first came across Kumagusu surfing YouTube, and I came across some of their live videos, and I was really impressed with their kind of fusing of like psychedelic rock esque jams into like Tokyo indie rock. And they had a lot of energy in their performance. So I was looking forward to this album, hoping that maybe some of that energy would transfer well into the record. And I'm happy to say that it did. This album is clean, very cleanly produced, but it's not sterile and it doesn't detract from the performances, which are, as I'd hoped, full of energy and very direct. Kumagusu's sound employs a lot of the same kind of tones and sonic qualities as really any Tokyo based indie rock band right now. There's a lot of use of reverb and delay effects on the guitar. There's very sparse use of distortion, and guitars only get really kind of fuzzy and distorted on a guitar solo. The vocals are very clean, and they're very often doubled to give them a nice chorus effect. And they occasionally get kind of loud and impassioned and a little raspy to just add a little bit of emphasis to a part of a song. The bass very much is a background instrument in the mix here. It's very kind of quiet, and it's not really given the spotlight at any point in time. It very much plays the backing to what the guitars are doing and the vocals. And the drums are also kind of in the background, but less so than the bass. They're very tight, they're very energetic, and they do some really cool grooves and like rhythmic stuff. And when the drums are really doing something cool, the guitars and vocals aren't afraid to kind of let off a little bit in the mix and give the drums a bit more room to take a bit more of the spotlight. But where this album separates itself from many of its Tokyo indie peers is this album is not poppy, really. There's not a focus on making catchy, poppy, immediate choruses. There's not really any like earworm melodies that really just stick in your head or anything like that. Though there is some good melody work on here, it's not poppy, catchy, immediate stuff. Instead, Kumagusu opts to explore kind of psychedelic jams at times with kind of roaring walls of echoes that kind of wash over the songs like waves. They also explore song structure a lot. They really like to experiment with the structure of their songs, and sometimes it isn't really clear what part's the verse and what part's the chorus and where transitions are. The parts kind of often bleed into each other, and oftentimes the songs bleed into each other as well. They experiment with weird kind of start and stop transitions and kind of sudden builds and falls into other parts of the song. And while the album doesn't get hard to listen to or avant-garde or anything like that, it's not that risky, but it does like to experiment with the kind of typical indie rock formula a lot. A good example of this is the song Ato Katanaku, which has a very well put together and very tight groove between the bass and the drums that's very clear what the rhythm is. And over top of that, the guitars kind of do this kind of drunken call and response with each other, where one will play some chord and then the other will play, and they aren't really like tightly together on the rhythm. They're kind of sloppily placed about, and they kind of wave back and forth between that and a much more like put together, well ordered chord progression. And it kind of transitions between those every few seconds. And that's kind of the full groove, is this kind of disjointed part and then this more put together part that repeats. And when I call it disjointed, I don't mean that in like a bad way. Um, with how tight and together the bass and drums are, it allows a lot of room for the guitars to be really kind of sloppy and all over the place without the song being like muddied down or becoming confusing. You know, it's never hard to bob your head to it or anything like that. It reminds me a bit of that Number Girl song Fushigi off of Numb Heavy Metallic, that has this really kind of weird off kilter groove as like the chorus. And it's not quite as intense and weird as that, but it's kind of along those lines. They also experiment a bit with dissonance on this album, like on the song Fade, which is actually one of my least favorite tracks on here because the first like 2 or 3 minutes are really kind of dime a dozen indie rock. They don't really do anything all that original or interesting. But in the latter half of the song, it transitions into this instrumental groove that keeps building and building with this kind of like echoey, distorted noise behind it that slowly builds into this big kind of psychedelic wall of sound that really kind of sounds like a just really big wave kind of overtaking the song. And it has some really cool texture to it, and the groove is also really good behind it. The drums are very energetic. And yeah, it gets pretty distorted and kind of dissonant, and I like the texture of it a lot. I do wish it was placed behind a more like interesting song in the beginning, but the end of it, that song, is pretty good. Also, on the song Tsurime no, which was the single for this album, the chord progression has a little bit of dissonance to it, which I find interesting. It'll do this like chord progression of like 3 or 4 chords that are very accessible, very easy to listen to, very like they fit very well with the melody and what the other instruments are doing. But then the chord progression ends on this kind of sour, somewhat dissonant chord that really kind of clashes a little bit with what all the other instruments are doing before cycling back around to the beginning of the progression. But it doesn't really like clash harshly with what the rest of the instruments are doing. It just adds a little bit of color to it. It's just a strange bit of texture that is added to kind of color this much more accessible indie rock vocal melody, and what all the other instruments are doing are kind of colored by this strange dissonant chord. And it's a really just interesting choice, and I think it worked out well. This album shines most when it experiments most. Most of the risks that they take on this album end up going over really well. And the more experimental moments and kind of noisy, crazy moments are really tamed and kind of kept under control by the more tame and typical indie rock segments. But those are also its greatest weakness. I think at its best, these kind of more typical indie rock segments are energetic and well performed and are doing some sort of experimentation with song structure. But at their worst, they're just kind of dime a dozen indie rock, and they aren't really doing very much to distinguish themselves from the large pack of other similar sounding indie rock bands. But overall, I do like this album. I think these songs are all pretty good, at least solid. There aren't really any horrible songs on here or any just big glaring flaws in the album. But at the same time, the album doesn't really blow me away. And this isn't stuff that I'm unfamiliar to, and this is uncharted territory or anything like that. Um, I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10. I do like the album. I recommend you check it out if you are into the current indie rock Tokyo sound. This band has a lot of similar sounds and qualities to a lot of its contemporaries, but it also does a fair amount to distinguish itself from the pack. And if you're kind of getting tired of that Tokyo indie rock sound, and I know a lot of people are, then this album might have enough kind of originality to set itself apart from the rest of its peers, and it might be worth checking out. But yeah, that's me. New Kumagusu album, Natsu. It's pretty solid. It's worth a listen. Before I go, I do want to say sorry about no reviews the past couple weeks. I've been traveling around a whole bunch, and then I was going to do this review last week, but then Amazon got delayed somehow and didn't ship this album to me for like a week after it came out. So it all got kind of pushed back a week, and now I'm reviewing it now, and my schedule's just a mess right now. But we are back on the Sunday review schedule. I'll have another one for you guys next week. I'll see you then. Peace.